Hey, I'm James. I'm the youth pastor, and I get to preach this morning, bring the Word of God to you. So let's dive right into it. We are in a series called Unlikely. God showing up in unlikely ways with unlikely people. And so I actually get to finish the series today, and we're going to take a study into one of my absolute most favorite characters in the whole Bible, a dude named Gideon. And if you have been around our student ministry at all in the last 4 years, you have heard me talk about Gideon because he is, I mean seriously, he's like one of my absolute most favorite people that are in the Bible because he does this incredible thing through God's strength, but he's also incredibly human along the way. And so I feel like I'm sitting in a room full of people that have a lot in common with Gideon, a lot. And so I think we can learn a lot from his story, from his successes, from his failures. And hopefully, like, we're just all going to grow a ton this morning as we just dive into this story. So if you have a Bible, we're going to be looking at Judges, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges. It's the seventh book of the Bible, so it's towards the front. Judges, chapters 6 and 7. And they'll be up on the screen as well. But just so you know, this is where we're going to be at. And let me lay a groundwork for the story that I'm about to tell you. So in the history of Israel, the Israelites were in Egypt. They were in slavery. God brought Moses along, delivered them from slavery. They marched around for 40 years, and then God sent them into Canaan, into the promised land. Now, while they were in the promised land, there was this thing that happened over and over and over and over again. The Israelite people did something that was terrible. They did something that was evil in God's sight. God gave them over to some country, tribe, whatever, that ruled over them, oppressed them, to the point that the Israelite people finally cried out to God and said, God, make this better. And then God sent a judge. This happened quite a few times. There were 15 judges. And one of those judges is Gideon. And we're going to hear about Gideon in Judges 6 and 7. So, like I said, if you have a Bible, get to Judges 6. Otherwise, it'll be up on the screen. Let me lay it out for you like this. Judges 6, verses 1 through 6. It starts out very predictably based on what I just told you. The very first words are, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Okay, they did something evil. I'll tell you what that is in a little bit, but keep that in the back of your head. And because they did evil, God gave them over to a group of people called the Midianites. And the Midianites, they didn't like the Israelites very much. And because they didn't like the Israelites very much, what would happen is every year the Midianites would come into Israel and they would just ravage it. Take all the grain, take all the animals, do terrible things to the people. They were a blight on the Israelite people. But because of verse 1, it says it right there, the Israelite people did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And because of that, God gave them over to the Midianites. And then in verse 2, it says, because the power of the Midianites was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. It was so bad that the very best option for the Israelite people was to leave town, get out of what was comfortable, what was known to them, and they lived in mountains, in clefts of mountains, in caves, because they were hiding. They were hiding. So just so you know, I actually have a map of where Midian is. So we have a context for what's happening. So let's put up the map of Midian right now. So Canaan is where the Israelite people lived, towards the top, and Midian is down at the bottom. And so every year they would make that trip. And you can see there's like the key down at the bottom, 0 to 100 miles. So if, as I look at it, it was about 100 to 150 miles that the Midianite people would have to travel to go do their thing in Canaan, to wreck the lives of the Israelite people. And this was bad news. This was really, really, really bad. But the Israelite people, they kept doing evil in God's sight. This is why God turned them over for this. And so in Judges 6, 7 through 10, we have something cool that happens that marks a potential change. And so in verse 7, the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian. Cried out, and God sent them a prophet. And the prophet said, this is what God says. Hey, I brought you out of Egypt. I brought you out of slavery. I rescued you from the Egyptians. I delivered you from the hand of your oppressors. I drove them out. I gave you their land. And he said, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live, but you haven't listened to me. So God makes it incredibly clear. Hey, Israelite people, you did this to yourselves. I told you to worship only me. I told you to be faithful to me. And yet you were unfaithful. And you worship the gods of the Amorites. And that's why we're in this situation. But they cried out to God. They cried out to God. And so the next verse, Judges 6:11, we'll put it up here. It says, the angel of the Lord came, and he sat down under an oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash. And his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. So here we have the angel of the Lord appearing to Gideon for the first time. And this interaction is incredibly cool. It's so interesting. I love it. So the angel of the Lord appears to Gideon, and he finds Gideon threshing wheat. Now, he wasn't threshing wheat on a threshing floor. Let me show you what a threshing floor looks like. That's next picture. Let me show you what a threshing floor looks like. This is a threshing floor. It's wide open. They did this because they wanted nature to do most of the work. So as they were separating the grain from everything else on the plant, the winds would carry it away. They did it in wide open spaces. Because, like I said, the winds would do all the work. So they would gather the grain and everything else would take off. But when the angel of the Lord came to Gideon and he was threshing wheat, he was not doing it on a threshing floor. Instead, he was doing it in a wine press. A wine press looks like this. Now, we're missing a key component here to a wine press. The way that they did this was that there was this open cavity down below, and they put like branches and stuff over the top, and then they threw the grapes on that, and so they would do their thing, and they would press the grapes, and the liquid would go down through it, and then they were able to gather the grape juice down below. So Gideon is down inside this wine press threshing grain, working way harder than he would have had to have worked. Why was he doing that? Because of the Midian people. Because he was so afraid of being discovered by the Midianite people. I imagine Gideon in this moment thinking, this is it. This is it. If we don't get this grain, if my family doesn't get this grain, that's it for us. We have to have this grain or we are going to die. So it was incredibly important that he did this in secret for the sake of maintaining his life. So the angel shows up. The angel shows up, and in verse 12, the angel appeared to Gideon, and he said this. He said, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think mighty warrior is the words I would have chosen to use when I found a dude hiding in a wine press threshing grain. Mighty warrior? How about scared wuss? Hiding. But God, the angel of the Lord, looks at him and says, mighty warrior. And we're going to see that trend continues, where God, speaking through his angel, saw something in Gideon that he didn't even see in himself. And he was speaking truth into the identity of Gideon. And I want you to know that isn't a unique thing to Gideon. You all are people just like Gideon, and God sees you better than you see yourself. And God has the ability, if you will let him, to speak words of truth into you that are truths that you might not think true of yourself. How many times can you say true in like 10 words? Okay? The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. And Gideon's response is awesome. He says, oh, really? If God is with us, why are we in this situation? Why has God left us to the Midianites? Why is the quality of our life so terrible if God is truly with us? And if I were the angel of the Lord and I walked up to that situation and I'm speaking for God and this guy says, really, where was God at? And like my natural temptation would have been like, oh yeah, Gideon, let me break it down for you like this. The reason why you were in this situation has nothing to do with God. It has everything to do with you. You've been unfaithful to God. You've been worshiping other gods. And yet you expect God to bless you? That's what I would have been like. That would have been if I'm stepping into that situation, that's what I would have wanted to say. But instead, in verse 14, the Lord turned to him, the angel turned to him and said, Go in the strength that you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? Instead of defending God, because God doesn't need defending. God is God. He says, go in the strength you have. Not go in the strength that you will eventually have. Not do a bunch of push-ups and work on your sword fighting skills, and then you will be a mighty warrior. He says, go in the strength that you have. Now, currently, and save Israel out of Midian's hand. And so Gideon, completely human, responds by saying, why me? How me? In verse 15, how me? How can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least of my family. Gideon's like, it could be anybody but me. If I were to create a hierarchy of the people most likely to lead God's army against Midian, I'm down here. It ain't me. Anybody else, it ain't me. I don't have what it takes. I'm the least of my family and the least of the tribes. Not me. And the response is, this is so God. Hear him saying this not just to Gideon, but to you. Put yourself in this story. These are God's words to Gideon and to you. I will be with you. I will be with you. The strength of Gideon was God being with him. I am with you, and you will strike down the Midianites, and you will leave none alive. Oh man, it's so cool. It's so cool. And so Gideon has been spoken into. The angel has given truth to Gideon. And so Gideon says, okay, God, I hear what you're saying. Now give me a sign. And I'm going to stick one finger up because this finger's going to go, it's going to turn into a few things. But right now, Gideon is asking for a sign, his first sign. He says, God, give me a sign. And so he says, okay, I hear what you're saying, but let me do this for you. I'm going to prepare you a meal. If you really are who you say you are, wait for me, and I'll bring it back and serve it to you. And I can't help but think, so as we read along in the story, what happens is Gideon goes off, and he takes a young goat, and he cuts this goat up, and he makes broth, and he prepares the goat for him, and then he takes the ingredients of some bread, some yeastless bread, unleavened bread. He makes this, and then he brings it to him. Now, I don't know about you, but I would imagine this wasn't a 15-minute process. It was probably a quite lengthy process. I did some research on how fast you can cook unleavened bread, and the shortest recipe I found was 45 minutes. I don't know how long it takes to prepare a goat, but I'm guessing it's more than 45 minutes. And I don't know how long it takes to cook a goat, but I'm not going to eat raw goat. So I can't help but feel like in the back of Gideon's head, he was thinking to himself, I don't know if this guy's for real. And there's a chance that I'm going to go back and he's not going to be there. But when he got back, he was. He was there. And so Gideon brought the food to him. And the angel saw the food and he said, in verse 20, he said, take the meat, take the bread, place them on a rock, pour out the broth. And Gideon did exactly what the angel of the Lord told him to do. And the angel of the Lord took his staff, took the tip of his staff, and touched the food, and it lit up on fire. And now Gideon, who has heard the words of God, has now seen a miracle of God. He has his sign that God wants to do something huge through him. And when that happens, Gideon goes, alas, 22, verse 22, alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the face of the Lord face to face. I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. And when this happened, when the angel did this thing and Gideon had his huge response, the angel disappeared. Disappeared. And so Gideon's in this state of awe and shock and worship. And then God says to him, the angel of the Lord is gone, but the voice says to him, he says, peace, do not be afraid, you're not going to die. And so Gideon worshiped. And the way that he worshiped was he built an altar. He built an altar there, which is so incredibly cool. It's so incredibly cool. But in this moment, in this story, what you're seeing is God has spoken a word to Gideon. He has shown him a miracle, or a sign, and Gideon is Totally human. Totally human. It's cool. It's cool to see Gideon's humanity in the midst of God showing him incredible signs. And so the next thing that happens in the story is that God, later that same day, he says, Gideon, this is what I want you to do. So Gideon has been given a sign. Now God gives him a test. He says, Gideon, I need you to do something for me. This is what I want you to do. I want you to go to the altar of Baal, and I want you to destroy it. And in its place, I want you to build an altar to God. And there is an Asherah pole right next to that Baal to God, and I want you to knock that pole down. I want you to cut it into a bunch of pieces, and I want you to use it to build a fire. And we're going to take this evil, disgusting thing, and we are going to change it and offer it to God, and we're going to make it pure again. So God is giving him a sign, or he's giving him a test, and he says, Gideon, will you be my guy? And so Gideon gathers up 10 of his household servants, and it's really clear here that he didn't do it during the day. He did it at night because he was afraid of what was going to happen. And in a few verses, we're going to see why that was a legit fear. So he did it. He knocked down Baal's altar. He knocked down the Asherah pole. He built an altar to God. And God said, I want you to take this bull, and I want you to cut it up, and I want you to put it on the altar, and I want you to offer it to God. And he did everything that he was supposed to do. And so the next day, I'm gonna give you a picture of Baal and Asherah here in a second. But what happened the next day is that the people of the town woke up, and they saw something had changed. They saw that this altar had been broken down. They saw the pole was gone, and they flipped out. Here's the reason why they flipped out. Baal, this god that was being worshipped, he was like the god of gods in this culture. He had defeated all the other gods, and he was the god of fertility, and he was like the god of weather. And so they would pray to Baal and offer sacrifices to Baal because they wanted kids to carry on their nation, and they wanted weather because they were an agricultural society. They counted on the rain to happen when the rain needed to come. They counted on no thunderstorms and terrible weather that would wreck their crops, and they were like, we need Baal. And Asherah, I actually have a picture of an Asherah pole. You want to put up the picture of the Asherah pole? They would take a tree, they would tear it out of the ground so you can see that the roots are still there. They would put it where they were going to put it, and they fashioned these ornate idols to Asherah. And Asherah was also a goddess of fertility. And so what Gideon was doing was driving a stake, and saying, this is how we've been doing things, not anymore. And the people were angry because they were already terrified, right? The Midians could show up at any point and wreck their lives. They were already terrified. Now Gideon has upset the gods. Now our crops are going to be ruined because we've made Baal angry. Now we can't count on having kids anymore because the god and the goddess of fertility are angry at us. And there's just this, I just love it. Like they show up with their pickaxes and their forks and whatever. They show up angry. There's a mass of people. They're like, we're going to take you out, Gideon. We're going to kill you. And there's just this mob of people ready to just wreck Gideon. And this super cool, like all the dads in the room, all the dads just kind of puff your chest out a little bit. Pretty cool dad moment happens in the story. So Gideon's dad, Joash, steps between Gideon. He's like, son, I got this. Steps between the crowd and Gideon, and I'm going to read it because these words are so good. He says to the crowd of people that are ready to kill his son, are you going to plead Baal's case? Guys, are you trying to save him? Whoever fights for him shall be put to death by morning. If Baal really is a god, he can defend himself when somebody breaks down his altar. And drop the mic. He's like, is Baal, if Baal is who Baal says he is, y'all don't need to be fighting his fights. He's got this. And they let Gideon go. And two things happened. One, people's perception of Gideon changed. All of a sudden, he had taken a stand. The weakest from the smallest, most pathetic clan has taken a stand for something different. That's the first thing that happened. And the second thing was that God was reminding everybody, I haven't gone anywhere. Even though you've been unfaithful, I am faithful. It's so good. It's so good. It is so incredibly good. And so, as we move on in the story, the next thing that happens is something very predictable. The Midianites came. The Midianites gathered up their army and they started making their way towards Canaan, towards where the Israelite people were calling home. A very predictable thing was happening. And that had to be so terrifying to the Israelite people. This thing that they knew it was always like out there, like, as you're doing your day of work and stuff, like you would always, like if you're working, you'd always be like looking over your shoulder, like, is this the day that they're going to show up? Is this when it's going to happen? Is this the day that I'm going to lose my animals? Going to lose my grain? My family? And so in Judges 6:33 it says, now the Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the eastern people, they joined forces. They came over the Jordan and they camped in the valley of Jezreel. But something was different this time. Something was different. And in verse 34, we're going to read it. I'm going to read it and you're going to see it. Then the Spirit of the Lord came on Gideon. Something's different. God is showing up in Gideon. And it's not going to be the way that it has been. It's going to be different this time. So Gideon blew a trumpet and he summoned the Abiezrites, his tribe, his clan. He summoned them to follow him. And then, in verse 35, he sent messengers to some of the other tribes, to Manasseh, to Asher, to Zebulun, to Naphtali. He sent messengers and said, it's time to fight. Will you fight with me? And unbelievably, remarkably, 32,000 guys showed up to fight. And that's the reason why imagine, Gideon said, I'm the least qualified to do this. This is not something that I should be doing. But 32,000 people showed up, and there's two reasons for that. The first is the Spirit of the Lord was there. The Spirit of the Lord. Something way bigger than Gideon. And the second thing was that I feel like that thing that Gideon did where he tore down the altar and built up a new altar and said, things aren't going to be status quo anymore. We're going to flip the script here. Everybody sat up and went, hold on a second. You mean we don't have to settle for this? There's something different? And so when he did that, 32,000 men rose up. That sounds like a really great number. It's not. It's not. And I'll get into that in a second. But before we get into why this was not a good thing, 32,000 men, I have to tell you that Gideon did a couple other things. So Gideon asked for a sign, right? And he got his one sign. Well, now Gideon's like, okay, God, I know that you want me to be your guy. I know you want me to lead this army, but I need you to do a second sign for me. Give me one more thing, God. So he says, this is what I want you to do. Okay, tonight, while I'm asleep, I want you to I'm going to take this fleece, right? So the wool of a sheep. I'm going to put it in a wine press. I'm going to put it there, and tomorrow morning I'm going to wake up, and I'm going to go in there, and if all the ground around it is dry, and the fleece is wet, then I'll know that you want me to do this. Okay, God? We good? God? Okay, God? And God says, all right. So he does it. And the next morning, Gideon wakes up, and I he skips to the wine press. He goes, he feels the ground around it. It's totally dry. He puts his hands on the fleece. It's wet. He picks it up. He wrings it out. He gets a bowl full of water. And now he has his second sign. So now Gideon can lead the army. No. Now Gideon's like, all right, God, that was super cool. You've done 2 really God things. I need a third thing. Okay, God, let's do it in reverse. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put the fleece there again. But this time, I want all the ground to be wet, and I want the fleece to be dry. Then God. So if you're God, if you are God in this moment, are you like, forget it, Gideon. You had your chance. I'm going to go find me another mighty warrior. No. Again, God shows us his patience. The patience to give room to his people to become who he sees them to be. And so Gideon says, all right, God, okay, give me another sign. And he wakes up the next morning and he goes to the wine press and he feels the fleece and it's dry and he puts his hands around it and it's wet. And again, God gave him a third sign to show him, this is what I want you to do. Now, it is easy. It is so easy for all of us sitting in this room to look at Gideon and be like, please, I wouldn't have done that. God wouldn't have even needed to give me one sign. I would have stepped totally into God who God wanted me to be in that moment. And you're all lying to yourselves. We are so good at making excuses for all of the reasons why when God has something for us, busy, tired, not enough money, kids need my time, fill in the blank, I need a better job, I'm not really good at knowing the Bible, I don't know what to say. We have a million excuses for the million reasons that God gives, or the million times that God says, this is what I want you to do. We are lying to ourselves if we're telling ourselves that we wouldn't have done the exact same thing. But I will say this, Gideon had weak faith, not no faith. Weak faith. And God took his weak faith and built it up. And so now Gideon's ready to roll. So Gideon goes to his army of 32,000 and says, imagine what that would have been like. I'm commanding an army of 32,000 guys. That's a great number of guys. Let's fight. Until you find out, a chapter later, exactly how many people were in the Midianite army. Bible's real clear. This army of 32,000, Gideon and his men, were facing an army of 135,000. 32,000, 135,000. Are you guys ready to do some math? Math? Anybody? It's math time. All right, so if we are going to fight, Gideon and his 32,000 are going to fight an army of 135,000. That means I have to kill 4.22 people. This guy, 4.22. 4.22. 4.2. I'm like Peter Pan. But unfortunately, if this guy dies, now I'm up to 8.44. This guy dies, now I'm at 12.66. Suddenly, our odds don't seem so good. And God does a very God thing. Such a God thing. He says in verse 2, you have too many men. This is God talking to Gideon. You have too many men. I can't deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me. And so God's like, you're 32,000 guys? Please. Gideon, those odds are working too much in your favor. So he tells Gideon, go to your army and tell them, if you're afraid, leave. Put yourself in this situation, what would you have done? I like to think that I would have stayed, but more than likely, I don't like those odds. So I would have left. So of his 32,000 men, 22,000 made their way to the exits. And so Gideon's army of 32,000 is now down to 10,000. Math time again. I'm standing here with my army of 10,000. You have your army of 135,000. I have to kill 13.5 men. You 13.5, 13.5, 13.5, 13.5. But if you die, now I got 27. And now I need help because my math isn't quite that good. This guy dies, now I got 40.5. This guy dies, now I've got 54. I'm a little bit afraid. I'm a little bit afraid of taking my army of 10,000 into a battle with 135,000. And yet, at every step of the way, Gideon had to stand in front of his army and say, don't you worry, boys. We got this. Our God is bigger than that army. Trust me, trust him, and we're going to make this happen. And God does another very God thing. He says again, you got too many guys. 10,000 is too many guys. Let's bring the number down a little bit. So he says to Gideon, this is how I want you to find out. I'm going to separate your guys one way or the other. These guys I don't want to fight. These guys I want to join my team. So he says, this is what I want you to do, Gideon. I want you to take your 10,000 guys down to a stream to drink. And I want you to watch the way that they drink. They're going to drink one of two ways. Everybody can see me? You are either going to drink like this, or you're going to drink like this. See the difference? Of course you do. If you're down like this, with your head in the water, you can't see what's happening around you. But if you're like this, you're alert. And so God said, I want the guys who drink like this to be in my army. So we've got an army of 10,000 guys who go and drink, and out of 10,000, guess how many drank the wrong way? 9,700. So now our army of 32,000 has been shrunk to 10,000, has been shrunk to 300. Math time. Me and my 300 guys. If we're going to fight against the army of Midian, this is what we have to do. I got to kill my 450. 450. 450. 450. You die, now I got 900. Now you die, 1,350. Now you die, 1,800. These are good odds. And yet God in that moment said, aha, we've got him right where we want him. Now it's time to go. Now it's time, Gideon. Gideon, you are not going to believe what I'm going to do through you. And so again, here's Gideon having to stand in front of his crew of people and say, don't worry, guys, we got this. But I know how that statement I just made, I know how it feels. I know that in that moment you'd be like, I'm terrified. There's no way. But in admitting that, what I'm saying is the Holy Spirit, God's Spirit inside of these men to have courage well beyond their numbers. Like, I believe that every single one of them would have been like, let's get rid of 200 more. We got this. Get rid of 250 more. Gideon, me and 49 of my buddies, we're ready. Let's do it. I believe that that's what was happening in the hearts of the men, that God had said, this is what we're going to do, because they were following Gideon, because they were following God. And so Gideon has had 3 signs. He's on board. But God says to Gideon, hey, Gideon, just in case your faith is wavering, just in case, I want you to do this. Tonight, I want you and your servant, I want you to sneak into the camp and check it out. And so that's what Gideon did. Which, by the way, let's talk about this. What would an army camp look like that had 135,000 men in it? What would an army camp look like that had the animals to facilitate an army of 135,000 men? Holy cow. So Gideon and his servant go into this situation, and they find themselves walking up to a campfire as a man in the Midianite army was telling a story to his friend about a dream he had. About a dream that he had. And so, I got to find where it is in my notes. So, the man says in verse 13 of chapter 7, he says, I had a dream. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed. And his friend responded, this can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite, God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands. Now, I don't know about you. I have eaten some tough bread. But the idea of a roll of a bread, like going so hard into a tent that it would knock it down, I mean, that's a pretty incredible dream, right? I mean, I like to think that, like, with these arms, I could roll a loaf of bread pretty hard, but to, like, smoke a tent and knock it over, probably not. But this is what God, Gideon walks up to hear this story, and it's so cool. It's so cool that God did that. So now Gideon is feeling incredibly empowered. Now he's like, the time is now. And he goes back to his boys, his 300 men, and he says, get up. The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands. And so he says, this is what we're going to do. He gives all of the men a few terrifying, scary weapons of war. He gives them a trumpet. He gives them a torch. He gives them a jar. These are the weapons of war. Who needs a sword? Who needs a spear? I've got my trumpet, my torch, and my jar. Let's go, Gideon. And so Gideon splits his guys up into 3 groups. So he's got 3 groups of 100. And he says, I want you to, let's surround this camp. Which, by the way, 300 guys around a camp of 135,000, would you even be able to see the guys on either side of you? This is a huge camp, right? So Gideon says, this is what we're going to do. Follow my lead, boys. You're going to blow the trumpet. You're going to hold up your torch. You're going to smash your jar. And then you are going to shout for the Lord and for Gideon. Again. Torch up high, lots of fire. Smash the torch. For the Lord and for Gideon! And when they did this, a God thing happened. Tent mates turned on tent mates. Brothers turned on brothers. Tribes turned on tribes. The whole Midianite army freaked out. And they started to kill each other. And Gideon and his army got to stand there. And this is a gruesome sight, but they got to stand there and watch the power of God in motion. And as they wrecked each other, suddenly they just took off. They took off. And so Gideon and his men chased after them. And as they were chasing after them, more guys jumped in. And when it was all said and done, this army of 135,000 Midianites had been ruined by Gideon and his men. This mighty warrior who needed 4 signs from God, this mighty warrior from the weakest clan, the weakest member, had led an army that had completely changed the future of Israel. And so I want to put up Judges 8:28. I'll put up Judges 8:28. After this has all gone down, this is what happened. Thus, Midian was subdued before the Israelites and did not raise its head again. Midian had had enough. They didn't come back. And during Gideon's lifetime, during the time that Gideon was a judge over Israel, they had 40 years of peace under his judgeship. This mighty warrior of God, 40 years of peace. And then one last verse I want to share, and then we're just going to talk about one thing real quick. The next verse is, in Hebrews 11, there is a hall of fame. I don't know if you know this or not, but there's a hall of fame in the Bible. And they don't call it the hall of fame, they call it the hall of faith. It's a very biblical name. The hall of faith. And if you read Hebrews 11:32 through 34, you'll see a name that y'all should recognize. See, I'm not going to be in the camera right now. Ha ha. Gideon. There he is. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell you of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness. Okay, do these words not perfectly describe Gideon? Were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Our boy Gideon shows up here in the hall of faith because he believed what God said about him, and he followed God into what God wanted him to do. What an incredible story. Now, I have to say one thing. This is a true story. This happened in the history of humanity. Do not tell yourself that this is just a fun story. Oh, how great. This is fact. This happened. You will have the opportunity in heaven to stand next to Gideon and to be able to look him in the eye and to ask him the question, dude, what was that like? What was it like when you realized that angel was an angel? What was it like when you touched the fleece for the first time and it was wet? What was it like when you blew your trumpet? What was it like when you chased down that enemy? What was it like when you got to rule over your nation that had been ravaged for 7 years and you had 40 years of peace? You'll be able to ask him that question. How awesome is that? So I have two final questions. The first one is, what do we learn about God, and what do we learn about Gideon? Here's what we learn about God from this story. The first thing is that God is incredibly patient. There were so many times, like in my humanness, I'd been like, Gideon! Come on, Gideon! But God is patient. The second thing we learn about God is that He's not willing to share us. He wants every bit of our hearts. There's no room in our hearts for Baal, for Asherah. There's no room in our hearts for the Baal and Asherah equivalent in 2019. The idols that you put in the place of God, He's not willing to share you with those things. He wants every single bit of your heart. The next thing that we learn about God is that if God wants something done, He does whatever He wants, whenever He wants it. Whatever He wants, whenever He wants it. And then the last thing that we learn about God from this story is that He is faithful. He's incredibly faithful. When the people had abandoned Him, He didn't abandon His people. When the people had corrupted the beauty of that chosen relationship, He didn't abandon them. And then what do we learn about Gideon? What can we learn about ourselves from this story? The first thing is that Gideon wasn't qualified to lead the Israelite army because of his incredible military prowess. It wasn't because of his family pedigree, like he'd been groomed to become this guy. He was a very unlikely leader. He was qualified to lead the Israelite army because God said it was so. Because God put it in him to be that guy. The next thing that we learn about Gideon is that the absolute most important thing is having faith in what God is doing. Having faith in God's plan is what is ultimately most important. So I have to ask you, what are you doing to develop your faith? Are you just hoping to fall into it? What are you doing today to develop your faith? What's your relationship like in prayer? What's your relationship like with the Bible? Are you looking for the right kinds of people in your lives where you can be encouraged by brothers and sisters in the faith? Are you pursuing a life alongside God? What are you doing to develop your faith today? And then the last thing that I feel like we can learn from this story is that taking a scary God step is better than taking a safe James step. Taking a step that's comfortable and easy for me will never be as good as taking that scary God step. But it's in those scary God steps that we find the goodness of life, that we find the goodness of a relationship with Him, where we'll find that there's just a little bit a mighty warrior inside all of us. There's some Gideon in there. I want to share one final quote and I'll pray. Here's the quote. Faith is like a toothbrush. Everybody should have one, and you should use it regularly. But it's really not safe to use somebody else's. Okay? I live with a woman. Her name is Emily. She's my wife. I like her very much. There is no way that you will catch me using her toothbrush. I don't care if I can't find mine or mine fell in the toilet. I am not using Emily's toothbrush. And if she uses mine, that will significantly change our relationship forever. Faith is like a toothbrush. Everyone should have one, and they should use it regularly, but it isn't safe to use somebody else's. What are you doing today to develop your faith? And if you are a couple that shares toothbrushes, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to call you out or anything. Hey, let's pray. Let's pray together. God, we are so blessed by the story of Gideon and the way that you were patient with him, the way that you put a vision into him of what his life could look like, and how you gave him the faith at every step to be the guy that you wanted him to be. And God, I pray for everybody in here that we would take steps today to become a little bit more like Gideon, to trust you, to trust your plan, to walk into the life that you would have us live. I pray, God, for our connection with you, that it would be your strength in us, your spirit in us, that causes this goodness to come out of us. In Jesus' name I pray.